Hey everybody, welcome to the Rockshow, episode 211. Today we're going to be talking about the story of Stax Records. It's part of our Black History Month celebration. We always do two shows for February, Black History Month. Last show was about Thin Lizzy, and in particular Phil Lynott, the lead singer to that band. And today we're talking about a record label. You've heard of Stax, right, Rob?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, to me, in the 60s, when it comes to black music, 60s and 70s, uh, there's two labels: there's Motown and there's Stax, and there's quite a difference between the two. Both were very popular. A lot of artists that became world famous. People like Otis Redding were on Stax, and
Yeah.
BookerTandTheMGs and Isaac Hayes was writing for them. Sam and Dave. Sam Moore just passed away in January. Rest in peace.
Stax Record was like Motown. They had a lot of black artists.
Well, yeah, it was definitely right in that aspect. It was like Motown, but the difference is Motown was formed to kind of bring black music to white people. Okay, and that's fine. And Motown did that, and their artists were all great. They had incredible musicians working for them. Stax was a little more uh, black oriented from the beginning. Okay, they did have gospel and blues and artists and things like that. I mean,
Yeah, they were
it all
called
comes from that
Soyville.
anyway.
Yeah, Soyville.
Um,
Soyville,
yeah,
USA.
right,
And what
right.
was
Well,
Motown?
right. It was a lot like Motown, but I feel that the artists were a little more down and dirty. Okay. Kind of like more down and dirty blues types.
Yeah.
Okay. Than you had at Motown, which was more pop oriented. And I'm not trying to insult Motown at all. I mean, I love Motown music, but Stax was just more of a grittier kind of thing. That's the impression I've always had. So they were also based in the South. Okay, Motown was based out of Detroit and then eventually L.A. Stax was based out of Memphis in Tennessee, and they originally started as Satellite Records. I'll get into that in a minute, but it was started by um, two two siblings. Okay, they were business partners, Jim Stewart and Estelle Axton. And that's how you get Stax, Stewart, Axe, like that. Okay. Yep, Stax. Okay. So um the house band for Stax, like the Funk Brothers were the house band for Motown, the house band for Stax was Booker T and the MGs. You might remember them from the song Green Onions.
Yeah.
That was a huge hit, instrumental song. But they handled a lot of that music that you heard from Stax artists. Um, Basically, it was a very tight knit community at Stax. You had a small set of songwriters, the same set of musicians all the time. Okay, and the music was based in blues, gospel, even country in some ways, and the earliest forms of R&B. All right, and it created something, a genre called Southern soul music. Okay, that's kind of what Stax artists were referred to as Southern soul music. In the '60s, probably Otis Redding was their biggest artist,
Yeah,
and
definitely.
when he unfortunately passed away, okay, they had a deal then with Atlantic Records Stax to distribute and stuff like that. Okay, now originally, like I said, they were called Satellite Records, and they were founded in Memphis in 1957 by Jim Stewart. They operated very primitively out of a garage. Okay. The early releases on Satellite were country, rockabilly, okay, or sometimes straight up pop music songs. Um, Stewart actually played fiddle, so he's, I think, on a few of those early satellite 45s. His sister, Estelle Axton, began her financial interest in the company in 1958. They paired up. She mortgaged her family home to invest $2,500 in the company.
Wow.
Enabling Satellite to purchase an Ampex 350 mono console tape recorder to record artists. Okay. Which at the time was a state-of-the-art type thing. $2,500 today doesn't sound like much, but back then, if you put it in for inflation today, that would be $26,000. So
wow.
That's why she put a second mortgage on her home. The company set up a small recording studio in a converted garage near the National Cemetery in Brunswick, Tennessee. That was in 1959. In 1970, Stewart recalled that this portion of the label's origins and remarked, "I don't even remember the address," he said. "We didn't have any sound equipment or anything else but a small building and a lot of desire." And that's really the beginnings of Stax, is they really had a intention of doing something big, but they started off very small. Stewart at this time was introduced to black rhythm and blues by a staff producer named Chips Moman. And in the summer of that year, Satellite released its first record by a rhythm and blues act, Fool in Love, by the Veltones, which was soon picked up for national distribution by Mercury Records. However, Satellite remained primarily a country and pop music label for the next year or two. While promoting Fool in Love, Stewart met with Memphis disc jockey and R&B singer Rufus Thomas, and both parties were impressed by the other. Around the same time, and at the urging of Chips Moman, Stewart moved the company back to Memphis and into an old movie theater, the former Capitol Theater, at 926 East McLemore Avenue in South Memphis. Stewart recalled that he chose the building because it was in the area close to where Rufus Thomas lived, and several of the other musicians and writers that are still working with the studio today lived. They drifted in and out and got locked in on the rhythm and blues field. In the summer of 1960, Rufus Thomas and his daughter Carla were the first artists to make a recording in this new facility. The record, "'Course I Love You," credited to Rufus and Carla, became a substantial regional hit and was picked up for national distribution by Atlantic Records on its Atco subsidiary label. It went on to sell between 30 and 40,000 copies, becoming Satellite's biggest hit to date at that time.
That's pretty big at that time. 40,000.
At that time, absolutely.
They also had Albert King. I didn't realize Big Star came from them too.
Oh yeah, Big Stars.
Big Star. Also Isaac Hayes. They have the who's of musicians.
Right. Isaac Hayes wrote for a lot of people that were on Stax too, as well as his own music.
Wow.
Yeah.
I never knew that until I started looking at this.
Yeah. And remember in those days you could have regional hits.
Yeah.
So, that song, "'Cause I Love You," was a big hit in the South, and it sold 40,000 copies. So that's, pretty good. That's pretty damn good.
That is damn
good. With the success of that song, "'Course I Love You," Stewart made a distribution deal giving Atlantic Records first choice on releasing Satellite recordings. From this point on, Stewart focused more and more on recording and promoting R&B acts, not having really known anything about the R&B genre prior to having recorded acts such as the Veltones and Rufus and Carla. Stewart likened the situation to that of a blind man who suddenly gained his sight. From 1961 on, virtually all of the output of Satellite Records and its successor labels, which would be Stax and Volt, would be in the R&B / Southern Soul style. So country would be out, okay, and he would concentrate on R&B and what would later be called soul. As part of the deal with Atlantic Records, Satellite agreed to continue recording Carla Thomas, but allowed her recordings to be released on the Atlantic label. Her first solo hit was Gee Whiz, and it was originally issued as Satellite number 104, but it was quickly reissued as Atlantic number 2086, becoming a hit in early 1961. Her recordings would continue to be issued on Atlantic through mid-1965, though much of her work was recorded in the studios at Satellite or in Nashville under the supervision of the Stax staff.
Yeah, let me ask you a question. So were they a record label, or were they just people
Well,
that were
Stax was a record label. Right now, that has not been formed yet.
Oh, okay. So, but
you're still dealing with Satellite.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the formation of Stax is about to happen.
Okay.
So in June of 1961, Satellite signed a local instrumental band called the Royal Spades, changing their name to the Marquees. The band recorded and issued the single Last Night, which shot to number 3 on the U.S. pop charts and number 2 on the R&B charts. Last Night was the first single to be nationally distributed on the Satellite label. Previous Atlantic issues of Satellite material were issued nationally on the Atlantic or ATCO label. So that was the first time Satellite had something national on its own with that big song. Now, this led to a complaint from another company named Satellite Records. There was another Satellite Records out there, okay? And it had been operating in California for some years, but was previously unaware of the Memphis-based label. They didn't know about it until that big national hit. So accordingly, in September 1961, Satellite permanently changed its name to Stax Records. And that was Jim Stewart and Estelle Axton. You put their names together, you get Stax, and it was a way of just getting that California Satellite label off their backs.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, that's how that happened. Now, in 1962, the pieces were in place that allowed Stax to turn from a successful regional label into what would, alongside Motown and Atlantic, be a national R&B powerhouse label. Throughout the rest of the 60s, the label's operations would be greatly aided by several unique factors, including the label's record store. They had their own store, okay?
Wow.
Studio, artist, and repertoire, A&R, and a house band, okay, which was Booker T and the MGs. And the house band actually was given the power to vote with Stewart on which records would be issued on the label. So he gave a lot of power to his musicians, which most label guys wouldn't do. No. So briefly about the record store. Now, Stewart ran the recording studio where the auditorium had been in that big theater. Axton ran the Satellite record shop, which she established in the cinema's old lobby area where the refreshment stand had been. The store would later expand next door to an empty barbershop. It would grow a little bit. In the Satellite store, they sold records from a wide variety of labels, which gave the Stax staff firsthand knowledge of what kind of music was selling. And, you know, at that point, they are called Stax. I think there was still some reference to Satellite. You know, they're selling the Satellite records there, as well as things that would be called Stax. But what was great is by having that record store there, they could tell
what's selling.
Like, right, you know, just, hey, what's selling a lot of records today? Oh, this song. Okay,
it's kind of genius, you know.
It really is. It really is. I didn't know that until I was researching.
Now you know what's selling, but if you got a record store and you know you're also doing records, and you bring in records and you see what's moving, you can almost copy those songs in a way.
True. I'm sure they had all things, all eyes on it to see what was happening.
Because I gotta tell you that Booker T and the MC, they were pretty big themselves.
Yeah, well, they had their own hits. Okay. Yeah. But also the store became a popular hangout for kids.
Yeah.
All right. And that would also kind of gauge customers' reactions to things. And, they had a good kind of thumb on the scene, what was happening. Good. So it also provided jobs. Okay. They hired neighborhood kids, which, and people that were somewhat knowledgeable in the business. And some of these people stayed in the Stax family for a long time. Okay. Robert Gordon, the famous rockabilly guy that we saw a few years ago.
Yeah,
Sadly.
that guy was great.
Yeah, sadly he passed away. But in his 2013 book called Respect Yourself, okay, Stax Records and the Soul Explosion. Robert Gordon highlighted the importance of Estelle Axton to the company. He often called her Ms. Axton or Lady A. She was respected by the Stax staff and performers and was regarded as a mother figure
Wow.
to the company. She had no formal training in marketing or anything like that, but she had a good instinct when it came to music and many valuable suggestions to the young writers and musicians, which include Booker T. Jones. And he called her an inspirer. Okay. So she was a great lady. Very encouraging. She would stay behind the counter and give people advice on their music and things like that. Now, the A&R department, original A&R director was Chips Moman. He left the company at the end of 1961 after a royalty dispute with Stewart.
Mm.
He soon opened his own studio across town, okay? And Marquis member Steve Cropper replaced Moman as Stewart's assistant and A&R director. Cropper would quickly become a writer, producer, and session guitarist on dozens of Stax singles. Okay, Steve Cropper is a famous name in that 60s R&B stuff. He wrote a lot with Isaac Hayes and other people.
Yeah, because there was a cover. They were all together, just giving each other, probably bouncing ideas and stuff, and songs and lyrics. That must have been a hell of a table sitting there just watching these guys work. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Now, in the first few years at Stax Records, the house band varied. Although Cropper, bassist Louis Steinberg, drummers Howard Grimes or Curtis Green, and horn players Floyd Newman, Gene Miller, he was called Gene Bowlegs Miller, and Gilbert Capel were relative constants as the house band. By 1962, multi-instrumentalist Booker T. Jones was also a regular session musician at Stax. He was primarily the pianist and organist, but he played sax on that song, "'Cause I Love You," as was bassist Donald Duck Dunn. Jones, Steinberg, and Cropper were joined in mid-1962 by drummer Al Jackson Jr. to form Booker T and the MGs. And they were an instrumental combo that would record numerous hit singles in their own right and served as the de facto house band for virtually every recording made at Stax from 1962 through 1970. Dunn eventually became the band's primary bassist, replacing Steinberg in 1964. Jones was frequently absent from Stax over several years in the mid-60s while he pursued his musical studies at Indiana University. So during this period, Isaac Hayes usually replaced him as the house band's regular pianist.
Wow.
Although the two occasionally performed on recordings together when Jones was in town in Memphis. Other members of the house band include horn players Andrew Love, Joe Arnold, and Wayne Jackson. Hayes had auditioned for Stax in 1962 unsuccessfully, but by 1964, he became a vital part of the Stax house band, along with songwriting partner David Porter. Cropper, Dunn, Hayes, Jackson, Jones, and Porter were collectively known as the Big Six within the walls of Stax. That's what they called them. And either they were basically responsible for producing almost all of the label's output from 63 to 69. The Stax house band's working methods were unusual for popular music recording at the time, and it was this that attracted the interest of Atlantic Records' Jerry Wexler. Mm-hmm. For most major recording companies at that time, the standard practice was for the label's staff producer or A&R manager to hire a studio, an arranger, and session musicians who were to back the featured vocalist or instrumentalist, and the arranger would write sheet music arrangements for the musicians to work from. Such unionized sessions were run strictly by the clock, and there was a strict demarcation between the studio and the control room. By contrast, what Stax did, okay, is their sessions ran as long as was needed.
Wow.
And musicians moved freely between the control room and the studio floor and were free to make suggestions and contributions as they worked up what was known as head arrangements, in which none of the musicians' parts were written down and nothing was worked out in advance. These guys would just
go in there,
figure it out. In there and jamming, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. And they also had an input as to how things might sound in the studio. I mean, this was unheard of for musicians at that time.
That's a very, innovative way of introducing people creative freedom. Go in there, listen to it, play, see if it sounds right, and then we'll record it. Which is it's not a bad way.
I think it's ingenious. It's ingenious, and it gave people experience from both sides of the studio.
Yeah.
Okay, as musicians and producers. So Stax's unusual working methods first came to Wexler's attention in the fall of '63. He was expecting a new single from Carla Thomas, but when he contacted Stax, he was told that they had been unable to record for 2 weeks because of faults in the recording equipment. So he immediately flew Atlantic's highly skilled house engineer, Tom Dowd, down to Memphis that Friday. Dowd had the equipment fixed within 2 days, and on the Sunday, he was able to act as engineer during the creation of a new Rufus Thomas track. He was amazed by the loose improvisational feel of the session and by the way Thomas and the musicians developed and recorded the song. Thomas simply sang through the new number for the band once or twice, humming suggestions for their parts and sounding the rhythm by clacking his teeth close to their ears. Once the new head arrangement was established, Dowd started recording, and Thomas and the band nailed the song in just 2 takes.
Wow.
When Dowd returned to New York the next day, he had the tape of Thomas's breakthrough hit, Walking the Dog.
Walking the Dog.
Okay, yeah, which would later be covered by the Stones and other people. Yeah. Okay. And actually, Jim Stewart is on record saying that's the best sounding record Stax had ever. Okay. Stax Studios, talk about that. Now, another important factor with the success of the studio itself, the recording studio located at 926 East McLemore Avenue in Memphis was a converted movie theater, which still had the sloped floor where the seats had been. Because the room was actually kind of off kilter, imbalanced, it created an acoustic anomaly that was audible on recordings, often giving them a big, deep, yet very raw sound. Soul music historian Robert Bowman notes that because of the distinctive sound, soul music fans can tell often within the first few notes if a song was recorded at Stax. When Tom Dowd first arrived at Stax in 1963, the studio was still using the veteran Ampex mono recorder it had purchased in the late 50s. Dowd immediately suggested that a 2-track recorder should be installed. The Stax team were appalled at the idea, fearing that the distinctive Stax sound would be destroyed. However, Dowd pointed out that stereo albums sold for a higher price, which would mean more income for Stax.
Yeah.
At that time, you had mono records, okay? And stereo was just coming out. Stereo existed even in the 50s, but it was very expensive. I think some Frank Sinatra stuff was recorded in stereo in the 50s. But it was expensive to do. And in the 60s, a lot of famous albums would come out in mono and stereo. But the stereo one was a little more money. Okay. So in the summer of 1965, they installed an additional 2-track recorder, allowing Stax to record sessions simultaneously in mono and stereo. So they were still using the old equipment and simultaneously this new equipment. And then again in 1966, they upgraded the studio further with a 4-track recorder. This was state-of-the-art stuff. I mean, we have, today we see 36 tracks and all. It's,
Yeah, but back then that was pretty
And that was
normal.
state of
That
the
was
art.
modern art. It's like, holy shit, look at this shit.
Right.
This
I
stuff
mean,
is great.
the Beatles were recording on 8-track, and that was a big deal. That was like nobody was doing that.
Yeah.
So the label's biggest early star was singer Otis Redding. Okay, he arrived in 1962. Redding, however, technically was not on Stax Records, but on its sister label called Volt.
Both.
In that era, many radio stations, anxious to avoid even the hint of what was called payola, often refused to play more than one or two new songs from any single record label at one time, so as not to appear to be offering favoritism in any particular label. Now, do you remember what payola was?
Yeah, that they would pay people to play the songs
Right.
or record from the same label, same
Right.
record label. So
Right. One guy that got one famous person that got caught up with that in the 50s was Alan Freed, DJ Alan Freed.
Yeah, we talked about him.
Yeah, we did a show on him and all the payola scandal and all that.
Yeah.
So what they do? They just started another label. Okay.
Which is smart.
Which was smart. There's always a way around something. Okay.
Yeah.
A lot of labels did this, and they considered a subsidiary label.
Yeah.
Volt was founded in late 1961, and that was the home of Otis Redding. He was on Volt. Also, a band called the Bar-Kays, and a couple other artists were on there.
Yeah.
Volt releases were still distributed by Atlantic through Atco Records, and other Stax subsidiaries over the years include Enterprise, named after the Star Trek spaceship. Okay. Al Bell, who was part of the staff at Stax, was a big Star Trek fan. There was a label called Chalice that they put gospel artists on. Okay. And some other labels called Hip, Sapphire, Magic Touch, and Arch Records. Redding's first single, called These Arms of Mine, issued in October 1962, hit both the R&B and pop charts, though the label had enjoyed some early hits with the Marquis and Booker T and the MGs. Redding became the first Stax/Volt artist to consistently hit the charts with each release. In fact, each of Redding's 17 singles issued during his lifetime charted. Carla Thomas also charted with some consistency, but her pre-1965 releases were on Atlantic, not Stax or Volt. Between 1962 and December of 1964, Stax and Volt released several chart hits, each by Otis Redding, Rufus Thomas, and Booker T and the MGs. However, despite dozens of other releases, only 3 other Stax/Volt singles charted during this time, and all just barely. William Bell's You Don't Miss Your Water hit number 95 in early 62. The Marquis' Popeye Stroll hit number 94 in mid-1962. Actually, that song went to number 1 in Canada. Wow. And Barbara and the Browns' Big Party made it to number 97 in mid-1964. Beginning in 65, when the label formalized its distribution agreement with Atlantic, Stax/Volt artists made the charts much more frequently. Yeah. So, they were being distributed better through Atlantic by 1965, which exposed these artists to a wider national audience. And, of course, that's going to reflect on sales.
Yeah, because that wasn't regional more. Now you're reaching a whole audience.
Right.
You're going to over the United States and even maybe over Europe and shit too.
Right. Now, contrast that, like those songs I mentioned, even though they were only barely cracking the top 100, they were still regional hits. Okay. They, regionally, Stax was huge.
Yeah.
They had the record store. All the kids in Memphis and in the South wanted to go there. So, they had it great on both fronts. So in 1965, Jim Stewart signed a formal national distribution deal with Atlantic. And although he signed the contract really without reading it. Okay. And that decision would later cost the label dearly. On the distribution. Carla Thomas also formally rejoined the Stax label in 1965. Perhaps more importantly for the label's fortunes, the songwriting team of Isaac Hayes and David Porter began to establish themselves as Stax's new team of hit writers or producers. Hayes would also permanently join the Stax house band, often subbing for Booker T. Jones, who, like I said earlier, was studying at Indiana University. In addition to hits by artists like Redding, Booker T and the MGs, and Carla Thomas, 1965 saw the chart debut of Stax artists the Astors and Sam and Dave, plus folk artists the Mad Lads. Sam and Dave were technically at that point on the Atlantic roster, but were leased over to Stax by Atlantic, with Stax overseeing their recordings and issuing them on the Stax label. Virtually all of Sam and Dave's Stax material was written and produced by Isaac Hayes and Porter.
That's a pretty good duo.
Yeah, I mean, the song Soul Man.
Yeah.
That was written by Isaac Hayes and Porter.
Soul Man was
great. I mean, it's a classic tune.
Yeah.
I mean, whether you're talking the original or the Blues Brothers version, I mean, it's great stuff. So, Atlantic Records' Jerry Wexler also brought Don Covey and Wilson Pickett to record at Stax, though these songs were released directly by Atlantic. Covey's hits Seesaw, which would be recorded by later on by Aretha Franklin as well, and Suki Suki, and Pickett's 1965 and 66 hits In the Midnight Hour, Don't Fight It, 6345789, and 99 and a Half Won't Do, were Stax songs in all but name, as they were co-written by Steve Cropper, recorded at Stax, and backed by the Stax house band, but they were put out by Atlantic. Okay, so they were using Stax for the studios for their own artists. The amazing studio, get that Stax sound. Although Wexler was greatly enamored of Stax's organic recording methods, some of the artists they brought in created conflict. A June 1965 session with Don Covey created bad feelings, which came to a head in early 1966 when Wilson Pickett recorded to record new material. Although the session produced two hit songs, 6345789 and 99 and a Half Won't Do, Pickett's corrosive character caused havoc in the studio. I think he was known to get a little loped up. And session musicians walked out. He was a little tough to work with.
Yeah.
Okay? And the breaking point came when Pickett followed them outside and offered them $100 each to complete the session. As a result, the furious house band bluntly told Jim Stewart not to bring that asshole to the studio again.
Wow.
Okay. Also tired of another label capitalizing on the Stax sound, Stewart phoned Wexler soon after the Pickett session and told him that he wanted to do no more Stax productions of non-Stax artists. Okay. One Atlantic artist who was thus not able to record at Stax was the newly signed Aretha Franklin. So she suffered from that. She would have definitely recorded for Stax.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Easily.
Yeah, she instead went to Rick Hall's Fame Studios in Alabama, which was very similar sounding to Stax. Pickett's subsequent hits were also recorded elsewhere, including Fame Studios and Chip Moman's new studio after he left Stax in Memphis called American Group Productions. Through 1966 and 67, Stax and its subsidiaries hit their stride, regularly scoring hits with artists such as Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, Carla Thomas, William Bell, Booker T and the MGs. I got to mention, William Bell is somebody that really doesn't get a lot of credit. He wrote that song. He performed the song "To Be a Lover." Actually, a very interesting guy covered that song in the 80s. Do you remember who covered that?
I Want to Be Your Lover?
Not I Want to Be a Lover. It's actually called Forgot to Be a Lover.
Forgot to Be Your Lover. Who did it in the 80s?
Billy Idol.
Billy Idol.
Remember the video with him in the boxing ring?
Oh, shit. Yeah, it's coming back to me now.
Yeah. Remember that? That was an That was a William Bell Stax
Oh,
soul.
I didn't even realize that. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people didn't know that was a cover, that song, when it was a hit. I remember him telling everybody in interviews it was a hit cover, but nobody paid attention.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, he did say it, but
Yeah,
I didn't realize that was William Bell.
yeah, yeah. Other artists, having huge hits between 66 and 67, of course, was Booker T and the MGs, Eddie Floyd, the Bar-Kays, Albert King,
Yeah.
like you mentioned, and the Mad Lads. In 66, Eddie Floyd recorded a tune named Knock on Wood, okay, which he wrote with Steve Cropper. Stewart was initially indifferent to the tune. He didn't like it that much, but he released it after he was outvoted by the house band on the notion of issuing the record. So his practice of letting the house band decide things paid off. I mean, that song is classic, and he almost didn't put it out. Of course, there's the famous disco version of it by Amy Stewart, but the original soul version was a Stax recording. It became an international hit, okay, and Stewart was a happy man after that. He's glad he let the house band decide that one. So, unlike Motown Records, which frequently packaged its artists on review tours, Stax only did that infrequently. They didn't do that much. Motown would be like, okay, this is all our artists. We're going out on tour together, the Supremes, the Temptations, like that. Okay. Stax never really did that much. The first of one of those concerts that they did, though, became very famous. Okay. That was in the summer of 1965 in Los Angeles. They did a show of all their artists instead of Memphis. The show was a success in LA. But the Watts riots began the day after, and several Stax artists were trapped in that neighborhood during most of the violence. Okay. That neighborhood was burned to the ground, basically.
Yeah.
And Stax also sponsored a Christmas concert in Memphis for several years, the most notorious of which was held in 1968 when special guest Janis Joplin performed drunk off her ass and was booed off the stage,
man.
Yep. The most successful Stax package review was a tour of England and France in 1967, which played to sold-out crowds. Stax released several live albums from the tour recordings, including the best-selling Otis Live in Europe. And you have to mention what was going on in England in that time. Okay, the mid 60s was a huge time in England for blues. Okay. They artists like the Stones, the Yardbirds, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Cream, millions of these bands that were influenced by Stax. Okay. And Stax artists. And like I said earlier, the Rolling Stones covered Walking the Dog. To do a show in England with all these artists was just inevitable because they were so big over there.
They probably sold out every time they went out.
Yeah, total sold out crowds in England and France in 67. Also in 1967, Stax was at the height of its fame. Otis Redding, Sam and Dave, Carla Thomas, writer Isaac Hayes, they would all they would be considered main influences for what would be called funk music in the 1970s. Also signed to that record label, of course, was Booker T and the MGs, who were breaking boundaries in integration. Okay. Two of the band members were black, Booker T and the MGs, and two were white, which at that time was not a common thing. Okay. It was pretty much unheard of. That's one of the main, music is one of these things that always brings people together.
Yeah, of course.
And in the 60s, at a time when there was a lot of racial strife and boundaries were changing and, rules were changing, so social norms were changing. Okay. To have a band that was half black, half white playing soul music was something very revolutionary. And music brought people together. It always does, even today. In contrast to Stax's rapidly rising fortunes at this time, most of the house bands were struggling financially.
Yeah.
They worked long hours in the studio, working on songs and arrangements, but they were paid for recordings only when the actual sessions took place. So most had to play at local venues in the evenings to earn enough money to support themselves. Okay, they had families, but they were only getting paid when recordings were happening. The rest of the time in preparation, they weren't getting paid. So you think about the sacrifice these guys were making. All right, it's pretty incredible. To remedy this in 1966, Al Bell, who I'm not sure if he was related to William or not, I never knew that. I'm sure maybe somebody knows that. Al Bell appointed the members of the so-called Big Six, which was Hayes, Porter, and the four guys of Booker T and the MGs, as full-time salaried employees of Stax on a fixed salary of $125 a week, which if you put that in today's money comes out to about almost $1,200 a week. Yeah. Pretty good money.
Yeah.
This allowed them to quit their night jobs, jamming at local clubs, and become full-time professional studio musicians. And from this point on, Booker T and the MGs regularly backed virtually all of the artists who recorded at Stax. And Bell also persuaded Jim Stewart to set up a production pool in which a small portion of the royalty payments Stax was receiving from Atlantic was split equally between the Big Six guys.
Oh,
and that was to pay them for production duties with the artists that they backed. So they were getting a piece of things, and that was very fair.
So that, and they're not struggling now. They're getting paid pretty good money for, like, a house band.
Absolutely. And they could just concentrate on their music. So Stax was located in Memphis, as we said, and that was still at that time kind of a segregated city. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated there in 1968. There was much racism in the area still, but the Stax recording studio seemed to be an escape from that. The artists went into the studio, and they were there for one reason only, and that was to make hit music, some of which had social consciousness in the lyrics, okay? And some of the songs became a soundtrack for the civil rights movement. On their 1967 tour in Europe, some of the Stax artists were taken aback by the welcome that they received in Europe, enjoying a better reception in parts of Europe than they had in the United States.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, this was a time of racial strife, and Europe was past that. That wasn't an issue there.
So, Mike, let me ask you a question. At this point, how was the relation with Stax and Atlantic Records?
Well, Atlantic was still distributing the records.
Mm-hmm.
By 67, obviously, Stewart had put his foot down, laid down the law, saying no more non-Stax artists using the studios. I'm sure that's a problem. Okay?
Yeah.
But by 68, you're going to see a change, and we're going to get into that in a minute. Now, in the trip to Europe in 67 was a huge success for the artists and their label. It also marked another significant change in the political landscape at Stax. At a fraught tour meeting in Al Bell's hotel room, Steve Cropper was removed as Stax's A&R director, and Al Bell took over that position. Following the touring party's return to Memphis, Bell was also promoted to executive vice president, and horn players Wayne Jackson and Andrew Love joined the Stax rhythm section as salaried Stax employees. So Cropper, unfortunately, was out at that point, okay, in 67. Atlantic Records was, he was out as, I should say he was out as the A&R guy. I believe he was still involved in Stax. In 1967, Atlantic got sold to Warner Brothers, and the sale of Atlantic to Warner activated what was called a key man clause, which Jim Stewart had insisted upon in their contract with Atlantic. In the distribution contract, okay, this was called for the renegotiation or termination of the distribution deal in the event that Stewart's nominated key man at Atlantic, which was Jerry Wexler, either left the company or sold his stock in Atlantic. Stax initially hoped to join Atlantic in the Warner buyout, so Jim Stewart, Estelle Axton, and Al Bell flew to New York hoping to negotiate a deal. But according to Stewart, the figure they were offered was an insult. They were lowballed. So Stewart then approached Warner 7 Arts directly, but their offer was similarly unacceptable to Stax. So unhappy with either offer, Stewart then asked for the return of the Stax masters, but the executives at Warner's refused. It was then that he was informed that Atlantic's lawyer Paul Marshall had included a clause in the 1965 distribution contract that gave Atlantic all right, title, and interest, including any rights of reproduction, in all of Stax's Atlantic distributed recordings between 1960 and 1967. Only its unreleased recordings remained in the property of Stax. All of the masters delivered to Atlantic between 60 and 67 are still wholly owned by Atlantic's current parent company, which is called Warner Music Group.
Yeah.
Stewart regarded his original deal with Wexler as a gentleman's agreement, and when the distribution arrangement was formalized with the contract in 65, he signed it without reading it. Thus, he didn't see that clause thrown in there. Stewart was furious at what he felt was Atlantic's and Wexler's betrayal of his trust, although Wexler continued to insist for years that he had also not read the contract and didn't know it was in there.
Yeah.
Okay. And Wexler resented the situation in his 1993 autobiography book called Rhythm and Blues. To this day, he said, Jim got screwed and he felt bad about it, but he didn't know.
That's crazy.
Now, as a result of this turn of events, Stewart did not renew his distribution deal with Atlantic. And on May 13th, 1968, he instead sold Stax to Paramount Pictures, which was a unit of Gulf and Western Company at that point. The sale brought it into direct co-ownership with Dot Records, a pop label Paramount had owned since 1957. Consequently, Stax was forced to move forward without the most desirable portion of its back catalog, and without Sam and Dave, who had been unofficially on loan to Stax up to this point, and who were forced to return. They were forced to return to Atlantic after that split. Now, they never had another hit, even with Atlantic after that, but still, they weren't allowed to be on Stax.
Wow.
The company was dealt another crushing blow when Otis Redding died, and some of the members of the Bar-Kays in a plane crash on December 10th, 1967. In April of 68, Martin Luther King was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, the place where many members of the Stax staff regularly met and ate, and where Steve Cropper and Eddie Floyd had written the song Knock on Wood. In the riots that followed in Memphis after King's murder, many properties in the vicinity of Stax Studio were attacked by rioters, but Stax was left untouched.
Wow.
Nobody messed with that building. Stewart remained at the company, and former Stax marketing executive Al Bell became the company's vice president and co-owner, taking on a more active role as Stewart became less active in Stax's day-to-day operations. Estelle Axton disagreed with Bell's vision for the company at that point, and disputes between the two executives led to an impasse where Bell made plans to leave the company. Forced to choose between his sister and his vice president, Stewart asked Axton to step down from the company. By 1970, she had sold her shares and would later go on to found Free Tone Records, which had success in 1976 with a famous novelty disco song called Disco Duck. Okay, who's that? Rick Dees, right?
Yeah.
After the Atlantic distribution deal expired in May of 1968, Atlantic briefly marketed Stax and Volt recordings made after the split. These recordings featured the alternate Stax Volt logos used on the album covers of their labels, as opposed to the original Atlantic era logos, such as the Stax O Wax logo. Stax label recordings were issued on the Atlantic label and Volt label material on the Atco label. Gulf and Western owned Stax Volt releases, used new label designs, new logos, including the recognizable finger snapping logo. You had that up earlier.
Yeah, right here.
And new catalog numbering systems, right, to avoid confusion among the record distributors. So a little bit of chaos there, and they were trying to come up with different logos and different distributions. 1968 to 1972 was a period where Stax was basically an independent label. They had lost their valuable artists. They recovered quickly, though. Johnny Taylor gave Stax its first big post-Atlantic Records hit in 1968 with Who's Making Love, which became the label's best-selling single to that point. To begin rebuilding its catalog, Stax, under orders from Al Bell, released a whopping 27 albums. A Rufus Thomas album titled May I Have Your Ticket Please was to be the 28th album released by the Gulf and Western known Stax, but the album was never completed. And the 30 singles, they released 30 singles by mid-1969.
Wow.
That's amazing. By 1971, Hayes was established as the label's biggest star and was particularly noted for his best-selling soundtrack to the 71 blaxploitation flick Shaft. Hayes' recordings were among the releases on a third major Stax label, Enterprise subsidiary, right, that had been founded in 1967. The label also enjoyed success when it had the staple singers make a dramatic shift from gospel music to mainstream R&B. Al Bell began signing many more artists such as the Dramatics, Frederick Knight and the Soul Children, okay? Rufus Thomas, one of the first artists signed to the label, enjoyed a popular resurgence with a string of hits in the late 60s and early 70s. However, Stax's record sales were down overall under Paramount, whose management were also trying to exert more control over the operation. In 70, Stewart and Bell decided to purchase the label back with financial help from Deutsche Grammophon label, the European record company owned at the time by the giant Gramophone Philips Group, which was actually renamed Polygram Records in 1972. The financing on Deutsche Grammophon's end led to Stax's post-Paramount recordings being distributed outside of the United States by DG's pop label Polydor Records from 1970 until Stax would fall into bankruptcy. Very interesting. I mean, Deutsche Grammophon is still around today. They put out mostly classic records, classical music records, things like that. But they had their hands in a lot of stuff. Polygram Records had a lot of rock acts and things like that. By the fall of 70, both Steve Cropper and Booker T. Jones were frustrated with Stax's treatment of the MGs and left the company and stopped playing sessions for Stax. Even though Jones was given the title of vice president at Stax before leaving, as he put it, there were titles given to us, but we didn't actually make the decisions. A final Booker T. and the MGs album was issued in 1971. The two remaining MGs, Duck Dunn and Al Jackson, stayed on at Stax, working as session musicians on various Stax recordings, although they also worked elsewhere. In particular, Al Jackson worked extensively with Al Green at crosstown rival High Records, co-writing a number of Al Green's hits between 71 and 75. Stax, meanwhile, subsisted on its own between 70 and 72 using independent distributors. By mid-1971, the Stax logo was slightly altered, in which the color of the finger-snapping hand was changed from blue to brown. As co-owner, Bell undertook an ambitious program to make Stax not only a major recording company, but also a prominent force in the Black community. For the first time, many of the label's acts began frequently recording at outside studios, such as Ardent Studios in Memphis and recording studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and working with outside producers, signaling an end of that to that signature Stax sound.
Yeah.
Bell even created a comedy label called Party Records, and one of the first people he ever signed was Richard Pryor.
Wow.
Okay. And he made a bid for the white pop market by signing Big Star.
Big Star, yeah.
Okay. And licensing albums by Terry Manning, the UK progressive rock band Skin Alley, and Lena Zavaroni. In addition, Bell became heavily involved with various causes in the black community and was a close friend of Jesse Jackson and a financial supporter of his Operation Push. On August 20th, 1972, the Stax label presented a major concert, Watt Stax, featuring performances by Stax recording artists and humor from a very young Richard Pryor. Known as the Black Woodstocks, Watt Stax was hosted by Reverend Jesse Jackson and drew a crowd of over 100,000 people.
Yeah,
Most of them were black. Watt Stax was filmed by motion picture director Mel Stewart, who actually is the guy who directed Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Okay,
wow,
interesting tidbit. And a concert film of the event was released to theaters by Columbia Pictures in February of '73. By this time, the Stax recording studio was accepting outside work again, and in July and December '73, Elvis Presley recorded 3 albums at Stax: Raised on Rock, Good Times, and Promised Land.
Wow, that's pretty good.
Right, which produced 4 top 20 hits for RCA. He was signed to RCA, the label he was on since '55. Okay, he was on that label for a long time. So he came in, used the record label studio, and got that Stax sound on his recordings.
Yeah, that's nice. That's
now,
good.
1972 to '75, there would be a decline in Stax and eventual bankruptcy. Despite the success of Watt Stax, the future of Stax at that point was kind of unstable. In '72, Bell bought out Stewart's remaining interest in the company and established a distribution deal with CBS Records. Clive Davis, was with CBS at that point, and saw Stax as a means for CBS to fully break into the African American market and successfully compete with Motown.
Yep.
Bell had originally proposed that CBS buy 50% of the company, but Davis discussed it with CBS's corporate attorneys who saw antitrust problems. So a national distribution deal was worked out instead. However, Clive Davis was fired by the company shortly after signing that Stax distribution deal because of the reports that he used funds from CBS for personal expenditures, including his son's bar mitzvah. Okay. Davis, for his part, continues to insist that the official reason for his firing was only a convenient excuse and that in reality his quick ouster was a matter of a personality conflict. Without Clive Davis at the helm, CBS was very quickly had lost interest in Stax.
Wow.
The deal was altered by having the Stax label's profits cut by up to 40%, particularly since the CBS distribution deal had bypassed the traditional small mom and pop record stores in the black communities, which had been the backbone of Stax distribution in the past under Atlantic. Okay, they would go to these small record stores and give them the records. Okay, the CBS was only going to the big stores. All right, and they really weren't pushing Stax records at all.
Yeah.
All right. They felt that it would interfere with their own R&B artists like Earth, Wind, and Fire, and the Isley Brothers, and Sly and the Family Stone. They were all
those are all great bands themselves.
Yeah, but they felt that by Stax would be directly competing with them instead of realizing if they just promote them, everybody would benefit. Right?
Everybody will win.
Reports came into Stax of stores in cities such as Chicago and Detroit, the African American cities, not being able to get new Stax records, despite the
Hello.
Hey.
Yeah, you were just talking about distribution. So let's start from there.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry about that.
Yeah, you just froze. I was like, what the fuck? Oh, you
Yeah.
didn't
No,
have
I forgot to plug in my laptop. It died on me. Sorry. All right. So like I was saying, the CBS became uninterested in fully promoting Stax.
yeah.
Cities like Chicago and Detroit couldn't get the records. Okay. And but they wanted to get out of it, but they couldn't get out of the deal. Okay.
Yeah.
The last big chart hit for Stax was Woman to Woman in 1974 by Shirley Brown, which appeared on the subsidiary label called Truth. And it was handled by independent distributors. The single's success helped delay the inevitable demise of the company for several months. By 1975, all of the secondary Stax labels had folded, with only the main Stax label and Truth remaining. Stax had signed artists like Joyce Cobb, bringing her over from the Truth country music label that year, but were never able to produce recordings with her and other new talent. Truth Records was able to release a couple of other singles and an album by Shirley Brown, fortunately. Okay. Al Bell attempted to stave off the bankruptcy of the company with bank loans from Memphis's Union Planters Bank. Jim Stewart, unwilling to see the company die, got back into running things, okay, and mortgaged his Memphis mansion to provide the label with short-term working capital. However, the Union Planters Bank offices soon got cold feet and foreclosed on the loans, costing Stewart his home and fortune.
Damn.
Yep. In the 2014 documentary, Take Me to the River, Al Bell states unequivocally that the city's white power structure loathed the presence of such a successful black-owned company and was determined to destroy it by any means necessary, using the bank loans as an excuse. Very sad. Stax Volt and /Volt Records was forced into involuntary bankruptcy on December 19, 1975, and was closed by order of federal bankruptcy judge William B. Loeffler on January 12, 1976. 3 days before the bankruptcy proceedings, Union Planters intended to produce a memorial record album for Martin Luther King Jr., in which the proceeds would go towards allowing Stax to continue operations. So they were trying to help him out, but it didn't happen. Al Bell got arrested, and he was indicted for bank fraud during these proceedings. But later he was acquitted of those charges in August of 76. In early 77, Union Planters sold Stax, its master tapes, and its publishing arms for about $4 million to a holding corporation. Wow. So in the bankruptcy, Union Planters Bank got control of everything, okay, which is what happens when everything forecloses. The master tapes, the publishing company, everything came to about $4 million. The corporation then sold the Stax-owned master recordings as well as the name Stax Records to Fantasy Records later that same year. Effectively, that meant that Fantasy owned and controlled all Stax material recorded after May 1968 and the handful of pre-May 1968 Stax singles and albums Atlantic initially declined to distribute nationally in the 60s. None of them were hits. Fantasy also gained control and ownership of all unreleased tracks and alternate takes of Stax records, including those recorded before May of 1968, and gained the right to issue new recordings under the Stax Records banner. Stax's one-time McLemore Avenue headquarters were not sold until 1981, when Union Planters Bank deeded it to the Southside Church of God in Christ for $10.
Wow.
Almo/Irving Music, the music publishing partner of A&M Records, acquired East Memphis Music Stax's publishing arm in 1981. In October of 77, Fantasy announced it would set up a Memphis office primarily for the purposes of reviving the Stax label, with local promoter Bruce Bowles being hired as Fantasy's regional promotion and marketing manager. The next month, Fantasy appointed longtime Stax writer and producer David Porter to head up a revived version of the Stax label, which was relaunched in January of 78. Porter signed several new acts to Stax, including Fat Larry's Band, Rick Dees, and Show Nuff, and re-signed mid-70s Stax acts Rance Allen, Soul Children, and Shirley Brown. Porter also was responsible for overseeing compilations of previously unissued material by Isaac Hayes, Randy Brown, the Bar-Kays, Albert King, and the Emotions. The iteration of Stax released over 24 singles, this version of it, okay, including 9 that made U.S. R&B charts. By far the biggest hit of this era was the Bar-Kays song Holy Ghost, a number 9 R&B hit in 78. It was a remix and overdubbed version of a track the band had recorded for Stax in 1975. Fantasy had to make do, however, without many of the well-known Stax acts who moved on to other labels during those bankruptcy sessions and were enjoying a string of hits at their new homes, including the Bar-Kays, who was on Mercury, Johnny Taylor, who was on Columbia, and he had a big hit with the platinum single Disco Lady. Isaac Hayes was on Polydor, Staple Singers, and Richard Pryor ended up on Warner Brothers. The Dramatics ended up on ABC Records. Shirley Brown went to Arista, and the Emotions on Columbia, and later on ARC, after their new producer Maurice White relaunched it as a vehicle for his productions. Porter would leave Stax in 1979, and the label's new releases slowed down to a trickle. By late 81, Stax was strictly in the business of reissuing material recorded between 68 and 75, and previously unreleased archival material from the 60s and 70s. Their heyday, they still had no control over their records. Atlantic had that. 1982 through 2003, Stax would be basically a reissue label because Atlantic owned all of those from the 60s, and all the masters and everything. The Atlantic-controlled material has been reissued by Rhino Records over the years, which is a great. Rhino Records is a great reissue label. They put out great stuff. Okay. Also, Collectible Records is another one that's put out Stax stuff. Fantasy Records, meanwhile, also repackaged and re-released the Stax catalog it controlled on the Stax label, because Fantasy owned the non-master recordings of all Stax material for several of its Stax compilations. Fantasy issued alternate takes of Stax hit recordings in place of the master recordings owned by Atlantic. That's kind of cheesy.
Yeah.
Okay. When you get like a reworked version of a hit from a song they had no control over just to put it out. All right. It's, kind of sucks. In 1988, Fantasy issued the Various Artists album Top of the Stax, Volume 1, 20 Greatest Hits. This marked the first time an album was issued with both Atlantic-owned and Fantasy-owned Stax material. It was issued by agreement with Atlantic Records, and a second volume came out in 1991. So this would be the beginning of the Stax heyday music being out. Again. Okay. In 1991, Atlantic issued the complete Stax/Volt singles, 1959 to 68, what they had control over, as a 9-disc compact disc box set.
Wow.
Containing all of the Atlantic era Stax A-sides, it's an amazing set. The release earned a Grammy Award nomination for producer Steve Greenberg in the Best Historical Album category, and for writer Rob Bowman in the Best Album Notes category. The box set was certified gold by 2001, the largest collection of CDs ever to have earned that certification. Fantasy followed their lead and issued volumes 2 and 3 of the complete Stax Volt Soul single series in 1993 and 94, respectively. Volume 2 compiles the Stax Volt singles from 68 to 71, while Volume 3 completes the collection with the singles issued from 72 to 75. Volume 3 earned a Best Album Notes Grammy Award for Rob Bowman on that. In 2000, Fantasy issued a box set titled The Stax Story, which includes pre-68 material by arrangement with Atlantic Records. That's another very complete box set. Fantasy tried to revive Stax's sister label Volt Records twice during this time, first in the late 80s and then again in the late 90s. It didn't actually get off the ground. Now, after a decade of neglect, the Southside Church of God in Christ tore down the original Stax studio in 1989. Over a decade later, the Stax Museum of American Soul Music, operated by the nonprofit Soulsville Foundation, was constructed at that site and opened in 2003. A replica of the original building. Okay, so they rebuilt it exactly the same. Why they knocked it down, I have no idea. The Stax Museum features exhibits on the history of Stax and soul music in general and hosts various music-related community programs and events. The Soulsville Foundation also operates the Stax Music Academy and the Soulsville Charter School, all part of the same campus where the original Stax Records was created. Concord Records purchased the Fantasy label group in 2004, and in December 2006 announced the reactivation of the Stax label as a forum for newly recorded music. The first acts signed to the new Stax included Isaac Hayes, Angie Stone, and Soul Live. The formal relaunch came with the release on March 13, 2007 of Stax's 50th anniversary celebration, a 2-CD box set containing 50 tracks from the entire history of Stax Records.
That's a lot of songs.
Right, including the later stuff.
Yeah.
The first Concord distributed Stax album of all new material was a Various Artists CD, which was released on March 27, 2007, and entitled Interpretations, celebrating the music of Earth, Wind, and Fire. Soul Live was the first artist on Revived label to release an album of all new material, with No Place Like Soul, released July 10, 2007. On August 28, 2007, a 3-CD deluxe edition box set of the 1972 music event Wattstax was released, simply titled Wattstax. For the first time in over 30 years, almost half of the 25-plus performers at that event were finally heard for the first time, released in remastered stereo. There was stuff that was left out of the original recording.
Yeah.
Okay, same with Woodstock. That happened too.
Wow.
The whole CD, the 3-CD set still only covers about 1/3 of the entire concert, even with that. Okay, that lasted over 10 hours, that concert. Concord has not issued any statement to the possibility of preparing future releases that would cover the rest of it. Okay. Isaac Hayes' Wattstax set himself was released on CD in 1995. On April 9th, 2013, President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama hosted an event called In Performance at the White House, Memphis Soul. He invited Stax artists including Booker T. Jones, Steve Cropper, Eddie Floyd, and Sam Moore. First Lady Obama also led a workshop called Soulsville, USA, the history of Memphis Soul. In 2012, as part of the label Revival, Stax Records signed Ben Harper and released his album with Charlie Musselwhite called Get Up. On January 29, 2013, Harper won a Grammy for Best Blues Album. Nathaniel Rateliff and Night Sweats released their critically acclaimed self-titled debut album on August 21st, 2015. The band's live performance on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon is credited with having bolstered the band into the mainstream. In 2016, Stax issued an album of new material by one of the label's original artists, William Bell.
William Bell, here we go.
It was recorded in New York City and co-produced by him and John Leventhal. Okay. Stax Records was inducted into National Rhythm and Blues Hall of Fame on June 6, 2015, and was accepted by former Stax producer Al Bell in Clarksdale, Mississippi. On September 22nd, 2017, Stax released Soulsville, USA. Soulsville, USA, a celebration of Stax, a 3-CD compilation containing 60 tracks from their entire history of Stax. This release is an update of the Stax 50th anniversary celebration 2-CD compilation from 2007. Soulsville, USA contains 12 tracks not included on that 50th anniversary,
Wow.
There are 2 tracks in the 50th though that are not included in the Soulsville USA. So you kind of get both of them.
Yeah.
Now, in 2024, Stax was the subject of an HBO documentary series called Stax Soulsville USA, tracing the label's triumphs and trials to the present day. So anybody interested in what we talked about today, check that out. It's very good. It gives the whole history of everything we talked about. And that's it, Rob. That's the history of Stax.
Wow. I got to watch the HBO documentary. Have you seen it?
Yes. I saw it when it came out. I haven't seen it since. But
is it a few episodes or it's just one episode?
Couple parts, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I got to check that out because it's probably on Max.
Probably. Yeah. So, I mean, what a story. Okay.
What a story.
Yeah. I mean, so influential. I'm glad we covered it for Black History Month. And it really just, I mean, people have to know their history and they got to understand, where music comes from. And Stax was so influenced by so many people. Yeah, and
so many artists and so many. Otis Redding, where you start Otis Redding, where you're the big star, Isaac Hayes, you start going name for name. They're like, holy crap! They had a lot of great artists.
Yeah,
and the label's still around today, which is amazing.
Yes, and that's great. Okay, so Motown unfortunately is not around anymore, but Stax persisted.
Yeah, they kept coming back. The little choo-choo train that could.
Yep.
All right, Mike. So what do we say on the show?
At the end of every show, well, I want to thank everybody for watching, but at the end of every show, we say we don't get drunk.
We get lumped up.
Thanks, people.
And we'll see you next time.
Take care.
From previous shootings and subsequent shootings, because
there was a walkway right here to my left, and went through a hole in the fence and committed this murder. Now, he didn't admit